of Luke this morning as we work through the passage today. I found it, and this is actually all the passages that were given to us. I may draw on them. They're at least in my notes. Whether I draw on them in the end, I never know as I work through this, but all of them fit well together. But this was the gospel reading for this particular weekend and this particular day. And I actually found this to be a great text for us, for all of us, whether you're visiting here this morning, but for all of us who have really never known a time where we only worship in one service together. As we move forward and whatever angst or whatever thoughts that we might even be feeling about that, even in our excitement. I love this text this morning because I think it really spoke to me this week, and I think it speaks to all of us. It's specifically certainly about possessions and money, but I think Jesus takes it out there because it's really about greed. And Jesus will say, even as he tells a story, that greed appears not just in financial ways, but in it's all kinds of greed, he actually says. And so I want to engage our hearts with that. It starts out, as a lot of Jesus' stories do, with a question. I love this. We actually see some of Jesus' counseling skills in this, and I took some heart from that too, and I think we all can even take heart in that because in Luke, this seems to be coming up. There's a story, it's not similar to this story, but actually it is because I think it speaks at same things, but there's a story in Luke that talks about Mary and Martha, and Jesus is in their house, and Martha actually comes to Jesus because she's not happy with her sister Mary. And so she tattles on Mary to Jesus, and Jesus answers that in a very specific way. That's not our text, but here we have a brother who's tattling on his brother to Jesus. So we got families tattling on each other, and of course Jesus is meant to say something to reinforce and answer and bring some kind of solution to the problem, and he answers, of course, but he never fixes, and he actually goes a little deeper, and he does that here. Then someone called from the crowd, "Teacher, please tell my brother to divide our father's estate with me." Jesus replied, "Friend," there's actually a lot of wisdom in this, and over the years I've even started to do this as people come and they like to tattle to the pastor as well. And then you have to be the judge and jury over who's right and who's wrong. Jesus actually says to them, "Friend, who made me judge over you? Decide things as that." I'm not your judge. That's not a pertinent issue, but here's what I'll do. Then he said, "Beware though, guard against every kind of greed, because your life is not measured by how much you own." Your life is not measured, is the version, probably the King James, in the abundance of what you possessed. So that becomes the impetus then of this story, a parable or an object lesson that Jesus gives. So he answers the question, and then he tells them a story. And he says, "A rich man had a fertile farm that produced fine crops. And he said to himself, 'Well, what should I do? I don't have room for all of my crops.' Then he said, I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. Then I'll have enough room to store all of my wheat and other goods. And I'll sit back and say to myself, 'Self, my friend, you have enough stored away for years to come. Why don't you, my friend self, eat and drink and be merry?' But God said to him, 'You fool, you will die this very night. This very night your soul will be required of you. Then who will get everything you worked for?'" The parallel Old Testament passage for this was Ecclesiastes, which the writer and the preacher, the quester of Ecclesiastes, muses. He's like Eeyore. Eeyore is the spirit animal of Ecclesiastes. Well, why don't we work? Because when we work, we don't get to keep our money and we die and someone else gets it. Jesus is talking about that. Someone else will get for it. So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. That's our passage from the gospel, the good news of Luke. Where is the good news here this morning? You can go back to the first slide of the brothers, and I'll work through that. Jesus, I've already mentioned, he engages this story. He engages the brother. The brother comes, and there must have been someone died. Dad must have died. There's an argument. And the brother's not happy with how the money, the estate, and I just be money. It could be land in that day. It could be land in our day. The lawyer or the brother who comes to Jesus wants Jesus to solve the dispute. Jesus says, I'm not in that business. I am not called to be that particular person. I am not going to weigh in as to who's right and who's wrong here. But your question has betrayed something about your heart. So I don't know the answer, the right answer or the wrong answer. I'm not going to get involved in this dispute. But I can tell at the heart of the dispute, not only for you, but also for your brother, because you seem to be arguing about this estate, is something bigger, that if I actually answered your dispute, nothing would change about your heart. It's not that Jesus possibly couldn't have sat down and weighed and answered the dispute, but the dispute to Jesus is irrelevant, because all he's concerned ever is really about our heart. He's not worried about who gets the money in the estate, because you could actually judge the decision extremely fairly, and nobody's hearts would be changed. It's not the point. Not the point in all of our squabbles, typically. He's interested in finding out who's right and who's wrong, and what's fair and what's not fair. He's interested in our hearts. So he does that. The guy who asked the question, and we live in this world that's very much that way. I mean, if you are on social media and something goes well for you, or you actually win a dispute, or you actually feel like karma happened to someone else and they got what they deserved, one of the words of our day and age is winning. Hashtag winning. I'm winning. This is what the guy wants. He wants to hashtag win. Even if it's just a fair, equitable amount. He's being robbed, and he may not want to rob his brother, but he's being wronged, and he just wants to hashtag winning. Jesus isn't interested in that. He views his brother, and we view everyone as competition. Everything is competition. That's at the heart of even the story that Jesus tells, in the sense that as this individual comes, and he actually seems to be in competition with his brother, and he wants a right answer, and Jesus doesn't give him. Part of the problem is he's looking, he's scared. Maybe he's poor. Maybe there's a lack of possessions in his life. Maybe he lives in this world of scarcity and not abundance. Jesus is actually going to tell a story, and when Jesus tells parables, they're always about him. And one of the things that I think in the larger thing he's saying to this guy when he says, I'm not the judge, you have reduced me to an estate lawyer. That's not who I am. Your abundance is standing right in front of you, and you can't see him. You can't see him. Sometimes I wonder if we do that. We may not be arguing about estates and inheritance, but what do we reduce Jesus to in our lives? Our vending machine God, where we lack and where we need and where we want, and our desires and our longings. And Jesus is saying, you've reduced me into the God who is just going to come and fix your things. You've reduced me into this judge. You reduced me into someone who's just here to settle disputes and make sure life is done fair. You've reduced me because all you are, you're fearful and you're scared, and you've reduced me to your arbitrator when all that you ever need is enough in me, and your enoughness is standing right in front of you, and you can't see him. And then he says, beware and guard against every kind of greed. He tells a story kind of about possessions and finance, but this word every is encompassing all kinds of greed, because life is not measured how you... And if you statistically did, I think greed is maybe mentioned as one of like the 7 sins or whatever, the 7 abominable sins. The greed, if you do surveys with people, greed, and you did surveys of people, greed is the most unrecognized. No one thinks they're greedy, because we all live in this world of scarcity, right? Some of us can't pay our bills this week. Some of us have relationships that are breaking. Our children are, all we want is our children at our Thanksgiving table. All we want is this, and all of these things are breaking down around us, and we have this sense of fairness and this sense of rightness, and so what we long for in our own hearts and lives, what we think we need, what we think we have to have abundance or to be satisfied, we never look at it that way, because we actually look at all of our needs as necessities. And Jesus says, beware of greed sneaks up on you. He doesn't, it's not like, adultery. You don't wake up the next morning and say, boy, I wondered if I committed adultery or not. I mean, it's like staring you right in the face. But greed never stares you in the face. It never grabs you. And Jesus says, beware and guard against every kind of greed. And here's how Jesus defines greed. And this is so, so beautiful and so, so damning all at the same time. He says, beware of every kind of greed, because your life is not measured by what you have, own, or your circumstances. Here's how Jesus defines greed. He says this, beware and guard against every kind of greed, because your identity is not measured by anything but Jesus. And so you want to know where greed is in our lives, is when our greed may be a successful parent. Our greed may be to be that perfect husband or wife or spouse or partner. Any place you and I seek our identity other than Jesus Christ is greed. That's not my words. Those are his words. Be aware of greed, for your life, your identity is not measured by what you own and by your circumstance. It's not measured by your parenting. It's not measured by your finances. It's not measured by your health. It's not measured by any of those things. I mean, you can apply that. Where's our identity? Your identity can be in your next raise, your pension fund, your children, a new home. These are mine, my reputation. I can be greedy for a reputation. I can be greedy for good things. I can be greedy to make a name for myself. I can be greedy because there's reputation staked at 2 services. Right? Is that right? Is that wrong? I don't know if it's right or wrong. What if it messes up? It's just You know why it's do we do 2 services? Do we not do service? Do we do it this way? Do we do it that way? It's because your identity is measured by that. Nature Coast's identity is not measured in how successful 2 services will be. Nature Coast's identity is not measured in whether your children made it here this morning to church. Your identity is not measured in all of those things that we think good. My identity is not measured in my reputation. I can be greedy for a good sermon. But my life is not measured by how I preach. My competence, whether my children are good or not. Greed will always make us cling and hold on to things rather than get up. Because you know what? We can actually also be greedy and hold on to one service. Because we are greedy because we think our identity is not in splitting ourselves apart. Do you see? You go one way, you go the other way. It is knocking on the door, and we cling to what we have, and we don't give it up and trust that Jesus plus nothing is everything. Greed is whatever we obsess to control. And we all are trying to control something this morning, every one of us. He tells the story. Here's the fool. The fool in this story, you can go to the next slide, is drowning in his own self-absorption. He's had a good year of crops. He says, well, I did well, and so I'm going to build bigger barns. He's full of control. He's full of power. And if you actually read this, even in the original Greek, it's like, I said to myself, I did this. I said to my soul. I said to my identity, my psyche. I said to my identity, you are a great guy. I can eat, drink. I eat, I drink, I be merry. I mean, literally in the Greek, the eyes are everywhere. The ego is everywhere in the story. That, that the fool is one who has mastered his life. He's mastered his operation. He's mastered how it's work. And he's mastered it. And he knows that he lives in a life that can be out of control. He knows it's a life that is sometimes hard to rein in, but things have really fallen for him in pleasant places. And he is mastered this operation in a world that's radically out of control. He's the captain of his ship, and he's been the captain of his ship now all his life, and he has done well as the captain of his ship, and he has all of this set aside, and now he's going to eat, drink, and be merry. And he forgot one of the two great commandments, that God gave him whatever he had, to love the Lord our God with all his heart, soul, and mind. And one thing that is really apparent with all the eyes is he's forgotten other people. That even what God had given to him was made not just for himself, it was for other folks as well. How do we get to this point? You know, the book of Psalms, or I think it's Psalms or Proverbs, tells us the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. He's a fool. He's just said in his heart, it's all about me. You know, in the book of Ecclesiastes, how do we get there? You know, I think one of the reasons we get there, one of the reasons we seek control, we seek power, is we actually live in this world of disappointment. And this is where the book of Ecclesiastes, even in the passage, comes in as the quester opens up the first chapter of Ecclesiastes. You know why we can be here with this individual that's called the fool is because over time and over our lives, we have faced disappointment after disappointment after disappointment. Under the sun, things have been hard for us. You know, we try to take the crooked and make it straight, and we aren't so good at being captains of our own ship, and our ships are just always taking on water, and we feel like we can never get the water out of the ship, and we're doing this, and we get to this point where we've been disappointed time and time again, and we've been disappointed. And so what we do in our quest for control, in our quest to get out of the sinking ship, we turn to ourselves, because then we believe the only person we can actually trust in our story is ourselves, because others have disappointed us. others have not done and performed the way we wanted them to perform, then we haven't performed the way we wanted to perform. And instead of looking at others and seeing how they have not performed and ourselves as how we're not performed, what we begin to do is we just begin to buckle down and say, I need to perform better. I need you to perform better. I need you. You know, my identity might be in how large a church is. And if it's not large, well, that's your fault. Man, can't you guys go out and do what you're supposed to do? You know, I mean, it just goes on, and we seek control. And we're destroying everybody in our path and leading on this path to death. And Ecclesiastes is this actual book that talks about life under the sun, but it is a warning to never look at ourselves, nor to look at others, to find our life and our identity. For you new members this morning, your life and identity is not in the abundance that Nature Coast possesses. Your life and your identity as a churchgoer here is not in the identity and in the abundance of whether we have performed or I have performed well enough. If your life and identity is on the performance of the leadership of Nature Coast Church, you are in deep trouble. That may sound like a cop-out, but it's true. And Ecclesiastes warns all of us against that. Don't look to ourselves. We desire for control, we desire for power, because we desire to protect against the unknown. That's all this person was doing. Wasn't he just being a good steward of his money? He knows he's not the captain of his ship, but man, he has saved up, and at least he's saved for that rainy day. But he forgot one thing. We don't like to depend on other people. In our world, even given the events of the last, if we watch the news today, you know what we're thirsting for? Security. We just want security and comfort. But the one thing he forgot, and the one thing that I say at many of the funerals I do, is death shatters any illusion that we are in control. 100% of the time. Death shatters the illusion that we are in control, because death has 100% success rate, and we can't control it. Yet we clutch at our lives. We long for bigger barns. You know what it feels like for me to let go and trust? I actually shared this week with someone. You know what it feels like to quit clinging to things that I think I control, that I probably over my life have been good at controlling? It feels like death to me. Bingo. It will feel like death. I would rather die. I mean, we say that, right? I would rather die than have this circumstance happen in my life. Yes. It feels like death. And so long as we continue to cling, we miss the real life that actually only comes by resurrection, by healing. And resurrection in our own hearts, in our own stories, in our own lives seems completely out of reach because we continue to cling to our bigger barn of family, of reputation. You fill in the blank. Jesus, as he tells the stories, is saying to all of us, to the brother, you are in good hands. That's where your freedom lies. Our questions betray us too. We have questions. Questions about our own stories, questions about whether we've made the right decision or we've made the wrong decision, whether you should have done this with your children or not done this with your children. Questions that bring it back to our performance or to the performance of our significant others, the performance of our church, the performance of your children, your spouses. There is such a great freedom in just being able to say, in the midst of all of that, that as we come in our franticness and our anxiousness and begin to answer the question, this was helpful to me even as I've been through counseling, because one of the things my counselor would do as I would cling to things, well, what would that mean if that happened? Well, it would mean this. Well, it would mean this. It would mean the loss of this. And then she would say, well, okay. Well, what does the loss of that mean? Well, it would mean this. It would mean this. It would mean this. Okay. Well, what would the loss of that mean? And what would the loss of that mean? And that mean? And that mean? Drilling me all the way to the place that all you have left is Jesus. That's all we have. He's our only hope. Will 2 services work or not work? Jesus says that's a wrong question. Who cares? Who cares? What I want is your heart. And whether it works or it doesn't work, I am standing right here. And don't you for a second think that if it doesn't work, I'm not your abundance. But don't you think for a second that if it quote unquote does work, that I am also not your abundance. We're not building a bigger barn. Jesus has taken us and telling us that our identity is wrapped up in him. We actually read this in our call to worship this morning. It probably stung us. It says, we believe, God, that you do this, this, and this, but we live this week as atheists. How many of you cringed when you read that and said, I'm not atheist. Atheists are those bad people. You know what the fool does? You know what the fool says? The truth is that every one of us, the minute we are anxious, the minute we have sought control, have lived and made decisions as if we are atheists this week. If you wanted to know the broad summary of the story that we read this today, the call is for us to actually live as if God really exists and that he is faithful. Does God exist? And is he faithful? And how many, including me, have lived this week as if he really does exist and he's really faithful? And I have frantically tried to do this and I frantically tried to do that. I've agonized over this decision if he is not faithful, and the whole thing and the whole enterprise of my home, my marriage, my church, all rests in me. Am I living as God really, really exists and he is really, really faithful? Because he promised. Psalm 100, which was in this week, says that God is faithful from age to age and from generation to generation. My kids, my family, my sermons cannot make me rich toward God. Jesus can. If someone would get the communion servers who are our students this morning, how appropriate that our kids and our students are going to offer us the broken body and the shed blood of Jesus Christ. You know what this table is? This table is a reminder for you and I. You say, well, who can come to this table? Well, you know who gets to come to this table? Fools. Fools get to come to this table. People who built bigger barns get to come to this table because this table is a reminder that God said to Jesus, who was the richest man in the world, he is the only rich man in the whole world. God said to Jesus, this very night, Jesus, your life will be required of you. Your broken body, Jesus, and your shed blood, Jesus, will be required by you so that fools can become rich toward God. You see, in this story, Jesus becomes the fool. His life is required. His broken body and his shed blood. God said, tonight, this will be required of you so that fools who have spent their lives building their identities and building bigger barns can actually be rich toward God. That's the good news. That's the good news of the gospel. Is that though he was rich, yet for our sakes, he became poor. We are in good hands because the hands that we are in have been pierced and they have been bloodied. And they are the hands of God who serves his broken body and his shed blood to fools who this week lived as if there was no God. And he says, I know you've lived this week at times as if there was no God. Let me remind you that you are rich in me. And you do this till I come again. And you drink my shed blood and you eat my broken body. God has hands that didn't cling, that didn't hold back, because he who loved us did not spare his own son. He let go of everything that was perfect and good. And he let go of the abundance of what he possessed to give it to us. You see, he didn't just die for us, and he covered our guilt, and he covered our shame. It says that he died for us. He gave of himself. We have all of his goodness. We have all of his righteousness. We have all that belongs to him is ours. We have this table to be reminded that despite what we cling to this week, we are the richest people in the world because we have Jesus. And Jesus plus nothing